Hartford, Wisconsin, is the kind of town people use as proof that the world is still normal. The streets are quiet, the neighbors wave. The scariest thing most families expect is a deer in the road or a storm that knocks the power out for a few hours. For years, Hartford had gone without a homicide. That matters, because when a community lives long enough without blood on the pavement, it starts believing it has earned safety. That belief becomes part of the local identity. And then in July of 2013, that illusion cracked in the most intimate place possible, a bedroom. 19-year-old Jessie Blodgett was a sophomore studying theater at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. The people who loved her did not describe her as simply talented. They described her as relentless in the gentlest way. Naturally gifted, yes, but never satisfied. The kind of person who would practice longer than anyone else. Not because she needed to, but because she believed she owed her best to the world. Music was not a hobby for Jessie. It was a language she spoke fluently. She performed musical theater, played instruments, wrote songs, and taught younger students piano and voice. It did not take long for her to build a list of students, almost 30 in just a few months. She was also outspoken in a way that made adults pause. Jessie talked about sustainable living, environmental issues, and violence against women, not as trendy conversation, but as moral duty. Those ideas mattered to her, and they were becoming louder in her life, like a song reaching its chorus. On Sunday, July 14, 2013, Jessie had just finished an opening weekend performance of Fiddler on the Roof. The show had gone well, every seat full, the cast buzzing with the kind of energy that comes after hours of rehearsal, finally turned into applause. So when the cast planned a celebration, nobody thought twice about it. A pool party, a house with a huge yard, even a llama pen outside. Because sometimes life is strange in the most harmless ways. People filmed Jessie by the pool. She posed for photos with the llamas, smiling. In those clips, she looks like someone who has no idea how close a moment can sit to a nightmare. But when she got home around 1 a.m., her mother, Joy, noticed something was off. Jessie did not launch into a big story. She did not make a scene. She simply said she felt uncomfortable. She told her mom that some of the older men from the cast, men in their 40s, had been making passes. One had tried to pull her onto his lap. She said something that should stop any parent cold. Why do they always have to turn it there? It was a line that exposed a reality Jessie already understood, and was clearly tired of fighting. That even in spaces built around creativity and art, men sometimes treat women like the after-party prize. Jessie went to bed, but she also wrote. In her diary, she poured out what she could not fully say out loud. She described feeling like something was trying to corrupt what should have been simple, platonic affection. She wrote about men turning it into a competition. She ended with something that reads like both prayer and promise. She would recognize problems and confront them without fear. Then she closed the book. A few hours later, around 8 a.m., Joy quietly opened Jessie's door to toss some clothes into the room. Jessie was still asleep. She did not stir. It made sense. The summer had been packed with performing, working, teaching, volunteering. Joy shut the door and left for work, thinking her daughter had earned the rest. Late morning became early afternoon. The house stayed silent. Jessie had a piano lesson scheduled. Her student arrived and knocked. No answer. That is when Joy began calling for her daughter. Louder now, walking toward the stairs. She opened the bedroom door. Jessie was in bed, still. The bed looked unusually neat, like someone had made it for a photograph. The blanket wrapped around her carefully. Joy called her name again. No response. She walked around the bed, confusion turning into dread. She touched her daughter and felt something that does not belong in a mother's memory. Cold. And then she saw it. Discoloration. Marks on the neck. Wet clothing. Damp hair. Even though Jessie had been in bed for hours, Joy called 911 in a voice that wavered between disbelief and panic, repeating a detail that sounded impossible as she said it. My daughter is blue. When first responders arrived, what they found was worse than any rumor a small town could invent. Jessie had been strangled. There were deep abrasions on her wrists and ankles, consistent with restraints. The scene suggested she had been bound. There was tape under her bed that did not belong to the family, tape that matched the marks on her body, and there were no signs of forced entry, no broken window, no kicked-in door, no obvious struggle that spilled into the hallway. That fact changes everything, because a stranger breaking into a home leaves chaos behind. But someone who knows the house, knows the schedule, and knows they have time, can move quietly. And if the scene had been staged, if Jessie had been positioned carefully to look like she was sleeping, that meant the killer did not just want her dead. He wanted the world to believe a lie. In a town that believed it had earned safety, the truth was now sitting upstairs behind a closed door. And the most frightening part was simple. The person who did this likely did not run from Hartford. He walked away like he belonged there. Hartford police were suddenly carrying a case the town was not built to hold. A young woman dead in her own bed. Evidence of restraint. A staged scene. No forced entry. That combination creates two immediate paths for investigators. Either Jessie knew her killer, or the killer had been close enough to learn the family's routine and bold enough to walk into that home as if it were his. And in the first days, police looked where any community would look first, the last people who made Jessie uneasy. The cast party. The older men Jessie had mentioned to her mother were interviewed. One of them, the man accused of trying to pull her onto his lap, denied involvement. Investigators sought phone records. They requested data from social media accounts. They checked movements and timelines. And in the end, those men were ruled out. Their phones placed them away from Jessie's house that morning. At first glance, that sounds like closure, or at least direction, but it also creates a new problem. When the obvious suspects fall away, fear multiplies, because then the community has to face the possibility that the threat is not loud or reckless. It is quiet, it is local, it is patient. Police worked through Jessie's world: friends, co-workers, family routines, anyone with access or motive. But Hartford was small. Jessie was well liked. People said she had no enemies. Her friends gathered together in disbelief, trying to make sense of something that did not make sense. One described how Jessie could make you feel like you were the only person in the room. Another stayed up all night painting a portrait of Jessie for her funeral, a work of love created through exhaustion and grief. The town held vigils. Hundreds showed up. There was mourning, but there was also a quiet question hanging in the air. If it happened to her, it can happen to anyone. Yet, even while fear spread, investigators insisted the public was not in danger. That line is common in active investigations, but in towns like Hartford, it lands differently. It can sound like reassurance, or it can sound like officials know something they are not saying. Then, just a few miles away, another case unfolded. In nearby Richfield, a woman named Melissa had been walking her dog in a park when she was attacked from behind. A man armed with a knife. She fought back, grabbing the blade, refusing to go down easily. She ended up needing stitches, but she survived. And after she left the hospital, she did something that would change everything for Jessie's case. She gave detectives a clear, detailed description of her attacker and his vehicle. Young white male, late teens, tall, stocky, light hair, very fair skin, and a dark blue minivan. Older model, a Dodge Caravan. The detective interviewing her later called her one of the best witnesses he had ever seen, not because she had superhuman memory, but because she had been forced to focus in order to survive. An officer who patrolled the park heard the description and felt a chill of recognition. Weeks earlier, he had noticed a similar van parked in a way that felt wrong. He ran the plate back then, found nothing, and moved on. Now he realized his instincts had been pointing at something real. They tracked the vehicle. It was registered to a couple in their 40s. Neither fit the description, but their son did. His name was Daniel Bartelt, 19 years old, and when police called him, he agreed to come in. Here is the detail that makes this story feel unreal. When Daniel got that call, he was not hiding. He was at Jessie's house, at a memorial, consoling her parents, crying alongside her friends. He was part of the circle. That alone would have shocked investigators later, but at that moment, they did not even fully understand his connection to Jessie. To police, he was a name tied to a van. To Hartford, he was someone they recognized. Daniel and Jessie had dated in high school, theater kids, musicians, songwriters, people who sat together, made art together, and looked, from the outside, like one of those young couples everyone assumes will grow up into a familiar, harmless story. They had broken up, but remained friends. At least that is what most people believed. Daniel's parents would later describe a shift in him after he left college. Depressed, different, quiet where he used to be playful. Something not fitting right, like a smile that no longer reaches the eyes. And in the weeks before Jessie's murder, he had been around again, at the house, with the family, close enough to learn routines, close enough to know when Jessie would be alone. When Daniel arrived at the station to talk about the attack in Richfield, he was calm, almost detached. Detectives asked him to walk through his day. He said he could not remember specifics. They asked about the van. He admitted he drove his parents' Caravan. They noticed marks on his arms and hands. Daniel blamed work, then admitted he had lost his job. A lie inside a lie. Detectives pressed, and eventually Daniel admitted he attacked Melissa. He gave a motive that sounded like a confession of resentment. He said he wanted to scare someone because everyone else seemed confident. He wanted someone to feel like him. He was arrested for that attack. But the interview did not end there. As detectives continued questioning him, Daniel mentioned Jessie's murder. He spoke as if he knew details that had not been made public. He described her as having been raped. Investigators froze. At that point, the full forensic examination was still ongoing. That detail was not something a random community member should have known. Daniel had just stepped into the spotlight, and he did not even seem to realize the light was on. Back in Hartford, friends assumed Daniel would be released quickly. Even Joy tried to comfort him, thinking police were simply doing routine interviews. Daniel reportedly told someone to come pick him up in 30 minutes. But when his friends arrived, officers were waiting. Daniel was not coming out, and Hartford, Wisconsin was about to learn the most terrifying truth of all. The killer was not a shadow outside the window. He was someone who had been welcomed inside. Once Daniel Bartelt was in custody for the park attack, investigators moved fast. They had 2 cases now that were suddenly connected by more than geography: a violent assault in Richfield and the murder of Jessie Blodgett in Hartford. And they had a suspect who was not just nearby. He was woven into Jessie's life. Daniel's initial posture was denial. He insisted he had nothing to do with Jessie's death. He offered explanations that sounded more like stories than truth. He tried to shape the narrative in a way that put him close to Jessie, but not responsible. Investigators did what they always do when someone talks too much and remembers too little. They followed the timeline. Jessie had been found shortly after noon. Her mother left for work around 8 a.m. Jessie was believed to have been killed mid-morning after Joy left before she returned. No forced entry suggests the killer either had access, knew how to enter quietly, or was let in. If Daniel had been watching the family routine, he would know the window. He would know when Jessie would be asleep, and he would know how long he had before anyone returned. The more detectives looked, the more the story began to harden into something ugly and specific. They checked surveillance footage around the area. They looked for Daniel's movements. They found him on camera at a park, walking near garbage bins. That might sound ordinary until you understand what investigators believed happened next. They went to the bins he was seen near, and they pulled out the contents. What they found was not random trash. It was the kind of evidence that makes detectives look at each other and stop speaking for a second, because the case just turned from question marks into certainty. Inside the garbage, investigators recovered items consistent with restraint materials and cleanup, including tape that matched what was found under Jessie's bed. They also found evidence stained with blood. And then, forensic science did what it does when a person tries to lie louder than reality. DNA. Investigators recovered DNA evidence connecting Daniel to Jessie, including biological traces and transfer evidence consistent with a physical struggle. They found his DNA under her fingernails, a brutal detail because it suggests Jessie fought. That matters, because it strips away any attempt to frame this as a misunderstanding, a mistake, or an accident. People fight for their lives when they know someone is trying to take it. Daniel's home was searched. More rope, more tape, more indications that these were not improvised items grabbed in panic, but tools brought with purpose. Prosecutors would later describe it as a kit, not a metaphor, not a dramatic label, a set of things assembled for an act of violence. And then, another piece of the puzzle surfaced, the part that makes this case so disturbing because it reveals a mind rehearsing a crime before committing it. On Daniel's computer, investigators found searches and content tied to violent fantasies, material that mirrored aspects of what happened to Jessie, including the staging and the attempt to clean the scene. This is where true crime stories often slide into sensationalism, and we are not doing that here. The point is not the graphic content. The point is what it suggests: premeditation, obsession, and a willingness to learn from cruelty. There was also a detail that spoke to something twisted and personal. Investigators found evidence that Daniel attempted to delete a file connected to Jessie, including a song. That is not proof by itself, but combined with everything else, it looks like panic after the fact, an effort to erase reminders, to reduce digital ties, to control the narrative again. When you step back, the picture becomes horrifyingly clear. Daniel was not some unknown intruder. He knew Jessie, he knew her parents, he knew the house, he knew when the home would be empty. And after the crime, he did not flee to the other side of the country. He did not act like a man haunted by what he had done. He returned. He comforted the family. He cried with friends. He stood in a memorial as if he was another victim of the tragedy, not the cause of it. That is why cases like this rupture communities, because the damage is not only the loss of a life, it is also the loss of trust. People begin replaying every memory, every time that person sat on the couch, every time he smiled in the kitchen, every time he hugged someone while carrying a secret. For Jessie's father, Buck, the shock was not just that his daughter was gone. It was that the young man they had welcomed was now accused of doing something unimaginable. He was a straight-A student, never in trouble, a kid who made music in their home. Then the reality hit. The person capable of this did not look like a monster. He looked like someone you would let through the front door. With the evidence mounting, Daniel was charged with first-degree intentional homicide in Jessie's case, along with charges related to the attack on Melissa in Richfield, and he pleaded not guilty. That meant there would be a trial, a public retelling, a slow, exhausting process that would force Jessie's family to sit in a courtroom while strangers discussed the worst day of their lives like it was a sequence of facts on paper. And while the state prepared to show a jury what they believed happened in that bedroom, Hartford had to live with a truth it never wanted. This was not random. This was personal, and it was planned. Trials are not built to heal people. They are built to decide what happened and who is responsible. The rest, the grief and the anger and the sleepless nights, those things do not fit neatly into courtroom rules. For Jessie's family, the trial meant hearing details they would have given anything not to know. It meant seeing evidence, listening to testimony, and being asked, in 1,000 indirect ways, to accept that their daughter's final moments were violent and unfair. The prosecution presented the physical evidence, the restraint marks, the tape, the rope, the DNA findings, and the trail of items discarded after the crime. They argued that Daniel entered the home after Joy left for work, used Jessie's sleep against her, and then tried to erase what he had done by cleaning and staging the scene. The defense tried to create doubt. They challenged how evidence was handled. They questioned interpretation. They suggested alternate explanations. But when a case has both forensic links and a pattern of behavior in a nearby attack, the room for doubt shrinks. For the jury, the question becomes less about possibility and more about plausibility. After deliberation, Daniel Bartelt was found guilty of first-degree intentional homicide. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the attack on Melissa, he received an additional sentence related to that assault. In true crime, convictions can sometimes feel like endings. In real life, they rarely do, because a guilty verdict does not return a daughter to her parents. It does not restore the version of the world that existed before July 2013. It does not erase the images Joy will carry from walking into that bedroom, and it does not explain why. At sentencing, Daniel spoke in a way that frustrated many people. He did not give a straightforward confession. He spoke around the truth, acknowledging evidence he could not refute, describing his own ability to lie to himself, expressing sorrow, but still avoiding the one thing Jessie's family needed most: clarity. Buck, Jessie's father, responded with something that is almost impossible to understand unless you have lived inside grief long enough for it to change shape. He offered forgiveness, not because he excused what happened, not because he forgot, but because he believed hate would destroy what Jessie stood for, and because he refused to let the killer dictate what their family became. He told Daniel that forgiveness does not mean the truth no longer matters. He said Daniel would not truly know forgiveness until he told the truth. That moment is why this case lives beyond the courtroom. Not because it is shocking, but because it reveals a rare kind of discipline, choosing not to become the thing you are angry at. After Jessie's murder, the community rallied. Vigils drew hundreds. People wore shirts with messages. Conversations spread into schools, groups, and churches. Parents spoke to their daughters differently. Friends checked in more often. For a while, Hartford felt like a town holding its breath together. And out of that, Jessie's family built something that tried to transform grief into purpose. They started a nonprofit project with a mission focused on ending interpersonal violence and promoting the idea that love must be stronger than hate. They spoke publicly about violence against women, the warning signs that often get dismissed, and the culture that normalizes harassment as if it is harmless. Because Jessie had been talking about those issues before she died, her father later said he heard her, but he did not fully understand until it happened to her. That line is a punch to the stomach, because it is honest. It is what so many families feel after a tragedy, the realization that danger was not invisible. It was just easier to assume it would never enter their home. This case also carries another lesson, one that is uncomfortable but necessary. The most dangerous people are not always the ones who look dangerous. Some of them are polite. Some of them know exactly how to perform the role of a grieving friend while hiding what they did. That is not paranoia, that is reality. And it is why Jessie's story is not just a story about one person's violence. It is a story about access, entitlement, and the way a community's sense of safety can become a blindfold. If you zoom out, Jessie's life was not defined by her death. She was a musician and a teacher, a performer, a writer, a person who believed art could change people, a young woman who cared about the environment, about justice, about the safety of girls and women, and who was already pushing back against a culture that tries to normalize harassment as part of life. The cruelty of what happened is that Jessie's final months were filled with causes that reflected the danger she would face. But the beauty of what her family built is that they refused to let that irony be the last word. In the years after, Buck described living with pain that never disappears, only changes position, sometimes background, sometimes foreground, always there. He talked about how he would never again end a long day at work with a walk around the block with his daughter, talking freely about everything under the sun. That is what homicide steals that the headlines do not capture, not just a life, a future full of ordinary moments, 1,000 conversations that will never happen, 1,000 songs that will never be written. And if you are watching this as a true crime fan, it is worth asking yourself a hard question. Why do stories like Jessie's hold us? Part of it is fear. We want to understand how evil can hide in plain sight, because understanding feels like control. But another part is responsibility, because Jessie did speak up. She told her mother she was uncomfortable. She wrote about men crossing lines. She believed in confronting problems without fear. And her story forces us to do the same thing, not in a dramatic way, but in the daily choices that shape culture. Take women seriously when they say someone made them uncomfortable. Stop treating harassment like awkward flirting. Stop assuming the safe town is immune. And stop believing that monsters always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like the boy who used to sit next to your daughter in class. Sometimes they look like a friend who plays music in your living room. Sometimes they look like someone who hugs you at a memorial while thinking about what he did. Jessie Blodgett's case is real. It happened, and it left Hartford changed forever. But her legacy did not end in that bedroom. Her legacy is the question her story forces into the open. In a world where violence can hide behind a friendly face, what do we choose to build next?